Alice Munro's story, How I Met My Husband, is one story that we can use to examine plot and structure. When we discuss structure, we talk about the sequence of events. This story begins in the middle because it is a recollection. It is a narrative, the story of how a young girl met her husband. When we examine plot, we think about why things happen. There are a series of events that take place that bring this young woman to this particular place in time. And because of things that happen in the course of the story, she encounters the pilot and ultimately meets her husband. When we consider the sequence of events, we may say what happens next, but with plot, we want to look at why things happen the way they do. The way we are told the story is through dramatic action, what happens, and dialogue. We learn about the young girl's school. We learn about her home life and how it is different from the house where she is living now as a hired girl. The new house, the house where she's living now, is much more modern, and for us it would still seem rather quaint, but when she compares it to where she comes from, there are things that are almost luxurious for her. There's ice in the refrigerator all of the time, and there's an automatic washing machine, and they serve canned fruit as opposed to fruit that has been preserved at home. One of the elements of the story is the point of view. Who tells the story? In this story, we have a first-person narrator, and the perspective, though, is not that of a 15-year-old girl, but it is the perspective of a woman who is older and who is now married and has children. Those are ways that we understand who is telling the story and from what perspective. We can look at whether or not the first-person narrator is reliable, what she reveals about herself, both her younger self, her more mature self, and what change is revealed in what we understand about the character. The fact that our character reveals things honestly, even those that are not very complimentary of her, indicate that she can be considered to be reliable. When we look at characters, we also look at whether or not characters are round, that is, they are developed and have dimension, or if they're flat. In this story, we have some flat characters that we could describe in a couple of sentences, like Loretta Byrd and Alice Kelling, and they serve specific purposes in the development of the plot. We can look at developing characters versus static characters. We have characters that change. Edie explains to us about the changes that take place in her life and for her as an individual. Those changes are revealed through the course of the telling of the story. There are characters that are static, those that do not change. Loretta Byrd remains the same. Ms. Peebles, we could say, changes some, at least Edie feels like she changes some, but it is Edie's development with which the story is primarily concerned. We have the pilot who comes into the picture, and he is a romantic figure. He is someone that she is struck by for a number of reasons. When they first meet, she has dressed up in her employer's evening gown. These pictures are of dresses that a woman might have worn about the time period when this story took place. We don't know specifically what the dress looked like, only the material and how she felt in it, that her hair was put up. And so when she first meets the pilot, she looks much older, but she tells us that she is embarrassed, that she is not able to joke with him. So we have that contrast between what she appears to be and what she actually is. And then we have the mailman. Dependable, reliable, routine. There is an expectation that is met from a practical perspective and from a very real perspective. So one of the things that we can look at in the story is how those two characters, those two men, compare. When we think in terms of a surprise ending and whether or not it's fairly achieved, we're looking at whether or not it logically follows. There is a logic to what happened. And even though we were surprised at the end and how she met her husband, when we look at the story again, we see that it is the logical conclusion to what has taken place in Edie's life. This also reveals things about her as a character. It revealed things about the choice she made and why her life turned out the way it did. There are a number of things that we can look at and contrast with regard to the characters. We can compare and contrast Edie when she was 15 to what she is now. We can contrast her honesty to her secrecy, the romantic fantasy versus the practical marriage, and we can look at the epiphany that takes place, what she realizes. We can look at Edie as opposed to the Peebles. She is from a rural background. They're not. They're much more cosmopolitan. She is very capable, and their view of, Mrs. Peebles' view of task is, lets us know that these are things that she's not used to doing and that she needs someone to help her. Loretta Byrd does provide some comic relief for us, but she also serves a plot function. She brings the news of the pilot, lets us know what's going on. She also brings Alice Kelling. When we look at the pilot versus the mailman, we can look at what's revealed about Chris Waters, what those things tell us about him, what they tell us about Edie, what they reveal about life choices, and we can consider whether or not the character represents something larger. Does he symbolize something beyond just her first romantic encounter? And then we can look at the same things about the mailman. What is revealed about him? What do they tell us? What do those things tell us about Edie, about life choices? And we can consider whether or not the mailman represents something larger. Is he symbolic? When we take all of those considerations, we reach a conclusion about the work. After we have analyzed all those aspects, looked at the text, found lines within the text that support our positions, and then we understand that we can interpret a work of literature in a number of different ways. However, we must have evidence in the work to support the interpretation that we make. When we state a theme, it is a generalization about a life. It accounts for the major details of the story, and it is not contradicted by anything within the story. When we identify the theme, that central unifying concept that provides insight, we consider the details of the story, we consider patterns, we consider allusions, references, symbolic meaning, and we consider the plot, the reasons things happen. We can also consider what the main character feels. We understand that through what they tell us and what they say and how they act and react to other people. We can look at what we have learned about the characters, and we can look at what the characters have learned and whether they change or develop. And we can look at actions and events which express ideas, which in some cases may be symbolic. one of the things we do when we evaluate a story is we look at whether or not characters are round or flat, whether they're developing or static, and whether or not they are developed enough to make the point they need to in the story or to contribute in a particular way. And in this story, the characters are developed enough for us to understand what they mean. Again, when we look at theme, we are looking for the insight. Think in terms of the literacy memoir you wrote and the insight you gained from that story. Same thing is true. This is a story from which we are gaining an insight. Remember that it is a complete thought, a sentence. It is a generalization about people and life. It identifies a main idea, not minor ones, and it accounts for all the major elements. So make sure that you account for everything, for the pilot, for Alice Kelling, for the innocence of Edie, for everything in the story. But make sure you don't inject yourself into the story. This is not about you and how you respond to this. It is what you understand based on what you've read. And it's not a moral. There might not be a moral. It may not be about what you should do or right and wrong. It is simply an understanding of the world. Go back to the discussion of theme to see specifically what we do and do not include when we are stating a theme. So what does Edie reveal? She tells the story from the perspective of a woman whose husband tells their children the story of her waiting by the mailbox for him. What does that tell us about human beings, both from what Edie realizes and what her life becomes? What insight do we gain from Edie's story about how she met her husband?